In this lecture, we're going to be playing with a few functions from this library. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the minimum, the maximum, and the lowest functions. And this is really how you use them. You can think of this t as a placeholder for the type for which you want to know the minimum, the maximum, and the lowest point, respectively. I know this might be cryptic to some of you, so we're going to look at a few specific examples. Here we have a simple explanation of what these functions mean for floating point values. The minimum is going to represent the smallest positive number that is representable with that floating point type. The maximum is going to be the maximum floating point number you can represent, and the lowest number is going to be the lowest negative number you can represent with that type. Things change a little bit when you start dealing with integers, and these functions are going to look like this. The minimum is going to be the minimum number you can represent with that integer, and lowest doesn't really mean anything for integral types. The maximum is going to be the maximum number. One thing you have to keep in mind is that the minimum may be negative if you are using a signed integer. If you are using an unsigned integer, for example, for short, minimum is going to be 0 and maximum is going to be the maximum number representable with that integer type. Here we are looking at numbers for short int, but the same story applies to whatever integer type you are using, even if you happen to be using long int or int without any modifier. Remember that we had to do a lot of things to get this range, and it was really hard to even do this for floating point types. So this library is helpful in getting a sense of what we can represent with a given type, be it floating point or integral. Let's head to Visual Studio Code and play with us. Here we are in our working folder. We are going to copy code from our template project, and we are going to go in the current project, which is Numeric Limits. We're going to go in, put in our files, go up again, and open this file up in Visual Studio Code. We're going to close this up, open the main CPP file, remove whatever it is we don't need. We are going to include the limits library. Remember, this is the first thing we need to do if we want to play with these facilities that we just looked at in the slides. And we are going to go down here and put in the code we want to play with. And it is ridiculously simple if you have watched the slides we just did in a minute. So what we're going to be doing here, we're going to be printing out the range for each possible type we want to play with here. So we're going to say the range for short int is from, and we're going to say std numeric limits. Short, that's what we want to deal with now, and we're going to call the minimum function. This is going to give us the minimum value we can represent with short, and we're going to say std numeric limits, and we're going to call the max function, passing in the type for which we want to get the range for. And the same story applies for unsigned short. You see, that's the type we are using here. We are also going to play with int, getting the range. We're going to use unsigned int to see how these things behave. We're going to use long and get the range. And we are also going to be playing with floating point types. So we're going to compute the range using the minimum function and the maximum function. And we are going to be also using the lowest function to see that this really is the same thing we described in the slides. We're going to do this for double and long double and see how these ranges come up in this program. What we're going to do is open up a terminal here. We are going to run the test to build with GCC, and the build is going to be good. And we can go down and run rooster, and we're going to get our values here. The range for short int is from minus 32768 up to 32767. And you see that this is exactly the same thing we saw in the lecture where we talked about number systems. We saw a way you can do this manually by plugging the number of digits in some formula that we came up. You can go back and check that out if you want. We do the same for unsigned short int, and then we look at floating point types. We're going to print the range for float, and if we use the minimum function to get the start of the range, we're going to get the minimum positive number we can represent with a float. If we use lowest, we're going to get the lowest minimum number, and the maximum is going to be the same. If you think this is really small, you have the option to open up this folder in File Explorer, and you can open a command prompt or a PowerShell window by hitting Shift and right-clicking and choosing this option here, Open PowerShell window here. And you're going to get a bigger window in which you can type things. We're going to run Rooster, and we're going to see things in a much easier way here. This is an option you can use, or you can even use the integrated terminal inside Visual Studio Code here, like we've been doing all along. There are a few other facilities you can use in this library of limits. For example, we can try and print out if a number is signed or unsigned, or get the number of digits we can represent in an integer type. These are a few examples I just chose because they are easy to understand and really helpful, but you can find more about this library in the documentation. And if you come here at cppreference.com, the link is here, you can really find all about this library here. This library provides a standardized way to query various properties of arithmetic types. For example, the largest possible value of type int is this. And we have a bunch of things we can do here. Don't be scared off by this template thing. Just think of them as placeholders for the type for which you are trying to query information for. There are a few functions you can call on these things. For example, there is min, lowest, max, that we just played with in Visual Studio Code. But you can see that there are a lot of things you can play with, especially if you have some math background to understand all these concepts here. You can play with this and see if it is helpful for whatever application you are doing. Okay, this is really all we set out to do in this lecture, to learn a little bit about the limits library. It is helpful in trying to understand the ranges for your types. If you happen to need these kinds of things, this is going to come in handy. We're going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to learn about some math functions we can use in C++. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.